Hitachi Energy is proud to partner with the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Powering Purpose is a new book resulting from the partnership between Hitachi Energy and Monocle. It tells the story of the people and the technology leading the energy transition and ushering in a sustainable and secure future. Hitachi Energy and Monocle work together to provide inspiration on powering people's lives and where to find the energy for change in the era of electrification. Secure your copy now at monocle.com or in store in Monocle outlets around the world. And if you want to understand the role you can play in harnessing connections to ensure a brighter, more sustainable and secure future, head to hitachienergy.com. Hitachi Energy and Monocle, inspiring the energy for change.
No country is, and no people are, a monolith of opinion. Russia is not an exception to that rule, and nor could it be. 144 million people of nearly 200 ethnic groups, speaking more than 100 languages, adhering to one or other of dozens of religious denominations, spread across a landmass 11 time zones wide. But war tends to have a reductive effect on perceptions of a nation, especially when that nation's government chose war. Not unreasonably, people concerned with defending their country or their continent from an invader tend not to be much interested in such nuances as may be at large on the other side of the lines. Since Russia launched its full-scale assault on Ukraine in February 2022, Russia has been represented in the global consciousness pretty much exclusively by the forbidding, saturnine figure of its president, Vladimir Putin, who has actually or effectively ruled Russia for the entirety of the 21st century. It is difficult to be certain, however, what Russians in Russia actually think of Putin or how they actually think of Putin and the war he started. Many Russians doubtless do support their president, but many may simply be unable to imagine anyone else inhabiting the Kremlin, or be enthralled to a pervasive propaganda apparatus, or be resigned to waiting him out, or fear that what replaces him might be worse, or just be reluctant, for obvious reasons, to openly voice such reservations as they may have. What kind of conversations are Russians having around their dinner tables at the moment? Is there any hope or ambition of breaking Vladimir Putin's grip? And what are the risks and the possible rewards of standing up to him? This is the Foreign Desk.
I was surprised. I was actually shocked. It was not just life as usual, but actually thriving.
The Putin regime rules primarily through fear. Just like the Soviet regime before, this is the main tool of their political control. The only thing we can counter that with is to refuse to be afraid.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Later in the show, we'll hear from Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Russian opposition figure who was released from a Siberian penal colony in August 2024 in a prisoner exchange. He had been sentenced to 25 years. But first of all, we're joined by the London-based author Yana Bakunina, whose most recent book is The Good Russian, In Search of a Nation's Soul, which recounts a visit to her original hometown of Yekaterinburg in 2023. Yana, let's talk a bit about that trip, the one you based the book on. Was there a difference between what you expected to find when you went back home and what you actually found when you got there?
When I did travel back to Yekaterinburg in autumn 2023, I had thought that I have been in touch with my friends and family and that I wouldn't be necessarily surprised by what I see. But in fact, I was surprised. I was actually shocked, is probably the right way to describe it, because first of all, on the surface, Yekaterinburg, the town where I grew up, or the city rather, it's a city with 1.5 million population, looked incredibly clean and polished and, thriving is the right word for it. And so it was such a strange thing to see. And of course, there was absolutely no mention of war. I mean, those sort of infamous Z signs, I probably saw a couple of them, sort of like on the side of a university building and maybe on a bus or something like that. But other than that, it was not just life as usual, but actually thriving. And secondly, when I was talking to people, in person, I've realized that whatever conversations we had over WhatsApp or over the phone, they couldn't possibly tell me what I could see in person. And in person, either I saw just absolutely heartbreaking examples of people being torn by the war and by the duplicity and by the helplessness and kind of this new way of living. Or I saw people who were actually very happy and optimistic about the future, who saw that thanks to sanctions, for example, the domestic economy is developing, there are new opportunities, they don't really miss anything in particular about being closer connected to the West. And I think there is something to say about where you're very much in tune with your own government policy. It's almost like, working for a company where, the chief executive sets the agenda and you're like, yeah, I'm on it. And I think, anyone would agree that working for a company like that is actually easier because you're completely on board.
There is a sundering in your own family. You find it difficult to talk to your father about this because he, a previously liberal Russian, has bought into the company line, as you put it. Did you get a sense, though, of what those Russians who support the war actually think about the war, and I guess, or what they say they think about the war, and the degree to which they actually believe it?
Oh, so they completely believe it.
Okay.
I don't think there is any other way to, because if you sort of approve of it, of course, they don't call it war, they call it special military operation. Sometimes they say war, almost kind of casually, but they absolutely believe it. This is what's so amazing about that. And I would say every single person who is sort of in line with the Kremlin policy, they have almost like exactly the same storyline, right? While people who are sort of opposed the regime and opposed to the war, they have maybe different views. But those people who are on board with the Kremlin, okay, sometimes, the kind of the story varies, as in, are we fighting NATO there? As in Russians, we're fighting NATO. Ukraine is nothing but a pawn in that argument. So suddenly, for example, right now, it seems that Russia is sort of negotiating with NATO countries about the peace deal in Ukraine. So suddenly it's like, who are you fighting? But I'm sure the narrative adjusts. And so whatever is the central narrative from the Kremlin, which is being delivered by not only central television, but, there is a whole network of websites and kind of news portals. And then you have the school books, like history school book. You have I had a look at all those websites which have the curriculum for very young school children. So all of that is kind of completely in line. And so, yes, they absolutely believe.
Do you actually think if you'd stayed in Russia, you right now would be all aboard for the war in Ukraine?
Oh, God. It's funny, isn't it? But it wasn't funny when I did think about it, because I was talking to people who went to this like really kind of, the best of the best state schools in Yekaterinburg, who got the best grades, who were like super smart. We used to sort of compete, who went to the best universities and they've got like good jobs. And yet they think very differently right now. But then fundamentally, I think that because there are so many people who, despite living in Yekaterinburg and having been abroad many times, but only, on holiday, who remained completely open-minded and were able to sort of retain that critical thinking or even acquire critical thinking, because, it's not like we were necessarily trained to think critically during the Soviet times. What really is fascinating to me is that the one example I always like to use is that, when I was still in Yekaterinburg and I was, let's say, 15, 16, we had a very sort of open attitude to LGBT community. We saw there were sort of LGBT films in cinemas. Men were openly gay. It was sort of very much in the open. And yet now they're telling me, oh, no, we were always very conservative. And I'm like, no, we were not, because I remember this. And so something happened in that interim period. And, it's Vladimir Putin has been in power precisely. So I left Russia in 1999 and he became prime minister and then president. So he became president in 2000. Mm-hmm. And so the system, of course, he's just the representative of the system underneath. But so that the whole machine has been working for a very long time. And I think also in the book, what I'm talking about is, reflecting the thoughts of my friends who were saying that when the war started and all these new laws came into effect, it became apparent that they've been preparing for it for a very long time.
But there's an interesting observation, I think, about how the machine you describe works. You quote Arkady Ostrovsky to the effect that propaganda doesn't feed on ignorance, which is what I think is often supposed, but feeds on resentment. How did you see that manifesting among your own friends and family? I guess specifically, what is it that they've found a way to resent?
So that book, The Invention of Russia, which I think was published in 2015, was actually instrumental in helping me understand my own father. So my father was incredibly bright, entrepreneurial. He used to be an academic who started his own business because he was very excited about the openness in perestroika. But in Russia, small or medium-sized enterprises have never been supported by government policies. So you always fought with the bureaucracy, the sort of, the mafia, anything. And so basically my father hasn't succeeded as an entrepreneur, and he sort of had other disappointments in his life, and not least that his only daughter went abroad and never came back. And so for him, this personal resentment with the system and disappointments with his own life were sort of suddenly being replaced with Crimea is ours, this kind of forget about your own individual success. That's the American model anyway. In fact, Russia has always been torn by this kind of the Western and the Eastern forces. And so remember what you are. You're a Russian man, and we value the collective belonging much more than individual success. We're not Americans. And so when he and people like him, who were effectively sort of defeated by the system in one way or another, and this, of course, is entrepreneurs, working class, academics, you name it, suddenly these people are being invited to sort of go on that bandwagon where Russia is great again. And that slogan sounds very familiar to many people, not just in Russia. You say yes.
I wanted to ask about another bunch of Russians that obviously you know well, which is the large numbers who have left the country since the full-scale invasion began. How do you respond to the criticism, which I'm sure you've heard, that those people, that community has broadly been pretty quiet? Is it that they fear reprisal from Russia reaching them where they are, or have they just decided that they can't do anything about it, or it's no longer their problem?
That's interesting. I guess I haven't really heard that criticism. So in their defense, I would say that people who have just left Russia, so in the years since the full-scale invasion, I would say they're just trying to get on. So I think it's people like me, perhaps, who have lived abroad for a very long time, who sort of have been maybe a little bit asleep. Certainly I feel it's maybe true to say that I have been until, let's say, 2014. And so we are sort of a little bit slow to be galvanized. But I think it's also to do with, have huge respect for Vladimir Kara-Murza. And of course, I wrote about him and many other brilliant activists in the book. But I think, we don't really feel that we have a strong opposition that we can sort of follow and be inspired by.
That was Jana Bakunina, author of The Good Russian, In Search of a Nation's Soul, which is available now. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our next guest appeared on The Foreign Desk back in 2017 in an episode wondering what a post-Putin Russia might look like. Vladimir Kara-Murza was optimistic then, which was remarkable enough, and he's optimistic now, which is extraordinary. In April 2023, a Russian court sentenced him to 25 years on charges relating to his opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and dispatched him to a Siberian prison colony. He was freed in a prisoner exchange in August 2024. Vladimir, nice to have you back here in our studios at Midori House. For obvious reasons, it seemed for quite a while like that might be unlikely. I wanted to start by asking to go back to the moment of sentence, and is there any way at all of explaining what it feels like to stand in the dock of a Russian courtroom and be told you're going to do 25 years?
Well, to be honest, my first thought was a job well done, because in the distorted Orwellian reality of Vladimir Putin's Russia, frankly, this is the highest mark of recognition one can get for political opposition work. I'm also a historian, so I couldn't help but think of the fact that this was the longest sentence for a political prisoner handed out in our country since the death of Joseph Stalin. And of course, it was a very pointed way in which my quote-unquote trial was organized. I mean, everything the Kremlin does is very deliberate, right? It's very in your face. So my 5 counts of criminal indictment were my 5 public speeches I had made against the war in Ukraine, against political repression and political murders in Russia, against the illegal nature in which Putin stayed in power in violation of term limits and so on. So these were my 5 official indictments or counts of indictment. But there was an unofficial one hanging over all of these, and this was, of course, my involvement in the international advocacy for targeted sanctions. Up until last year, I was absolutely certain that I was going to die in that Siberian prison. This exchange that rescued 16 of us from the hell of Putin's gulag last year in August 2024. Well, it was a miracle. Frankly, that's the only way I can describe it to this day. But it was, of course, in many ways a human-made miracle, because it was made possible by the relentless advocacy, the relentless efforts of so many good people in democratic nations, parliamentarians, journalists, public figures, who throughout all of these years never stopped speaking out, shouting out on behalf of all those people in Russia who are imprisoned because of their public opposition to Putin's dictatorship and to the war in Ukraine. And this exchange really shows just how powerful public opinion in democratic countries really is. And it shows that democracies, when they stand on values and work together, are stronger and more effective than any dictatorship can ever hope to be.
The prisoner exchange happens, at least as you understand it happens very fast. You're given almost no notice of this. You're just told you're leaving, and as you've written about it before, there was a certain sense of bewilderment as to what was going on and why it was going on. Was there a particular moment at which you allowed yourself to think, it's actually happened, I am free?
Well, first of all, none of us on the Russian side knew that any kind of exchange was being prepared. We were all kept in the dark until the last moment. One day, this was the last week of July of last year, 2024, I'm sitting in my cell, alone as always, solitary confinement in Omsk, and the security officer walks in the cell. The doors get open, the security officer walks in, flanked by 2 prison guards, and they take me to some sort of a prison office. And it's a small room. There's a desk, a chair, a large portrait of Vladimir Putin on the wall, and on a desk, there is some kind of a pre-printed template of something, and then there is a blank sheet of paper and a pen. And the security officer tells me to sit down, take the pen and write in my own hand, what's written on the template. And I look at it, and it's a request for pardon addressed to Vladimir Putin, in which I was supposed to admit my guilt, express my remorse for all the crimes I had committed, and ask Mr. Putin to please pardon and release me. Initially, I thought this was a prank. I saw this, I started laughing, but then I looked at the officer's face, and he was really in no mood for humor. And so I asked him, well, what is this? And he said, please sit down and write this. I said, I'm not writing anything like this ever. He said, why not? I said, well, first of all, because, I'm not the criminal here. I'm not guilty of anything. I have no guilt to admit. The criminals are those people in the Kremlin who are waging this war, not those of us who are in prison because we had opposed it. So I'm not admitting any guilt that I don't have. And I was suddenly woken up by this loud screeching noise of the cell doors being, burst open. And the same security officer barges in with a few guards. And he tells me, convict Kara-Murza, you have 10 minutes to get up, get dressed, and get ready. And at that moment, I'm certain that they're going to lead me out to a nearby forest and shoot me. But instead of the forest, they drove me to the airport. handcuffed with a police escort.
So you've literally, until you actually can see an airport, you have no idea what's going on.
I still have no idea because from the airport, they put me on a passenger plane to Moscow. They fly me to Moscow and they take me to Lefortovo, which is the notorious KGB political prison that we all read about, from Solzhenitsyn's books and so on. And the normal reason, the usual reason, somebody who's already convicted and serving time, in a penal colony is brought back to Lefortovo is to be indicted with fresh criminal charges. And so I just spent a few days there. I know this is going to sound weird, but I really enjoyed them because I could have all the books I wanted. I could write all day. I had a normal bed to lie on. Everything is in comparison. And then suddenly on the morning of the 1st of August, 2024, the deputy director of the Lefortovo prison walks into my cell. He's an FSB lieutenant colonel, flanked by security guards who are carrying the bags I brought from me from Siberia that were in storage. And so the FSB guy, the officer, tells me to take off my prison uniform and put on whatever civilian clothes I had on me. And the only civilian clothes I had was a black T-shirt in which I slept at night. Mm-hmm. My long johns, because in Omsk it was -14 in the winter. You have to put something underneath the clothes when you go outside. And the rubber flip-flops that I used to go to the prison shower. So I put this on, and he looks at me, evidently displeased, and said, "Don't you have any normal civilian clothes?" And I said, "Lieutenant Colonel, I'm serving a 25-year sentence in solitary confinement at a maximum security prison in Siberia. Why would I need civilian clothes?"
There's not a lot of reason to dress up.
He didn't have anything to respond to that. He just waved the guards to take me out of the cell. And just to underscore how long and how surreal that day was for me, that same evening, the 1st of August 2024, I would be meeting German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, still dressed in that T-shirt, the long johns, and the rubber flip-flops from the prison shower. So they escort me down the steps. But suddenly next to each of these FSB officers, I saw a friendly face, a colleague, a friend, a fellow political prisoner who'd been serving time all over Russia. And it was only then that I understood, because there could only be one reason why all of us would be sitting on that bus together.
All of which does prompt what I know is an obvious question, but I'm sure it is something that people wonder about, not just about you, but for people who make similar decisions in similar circumstances in many countries, which is, why go back?
Russia is my country. It's my home. I love Russia. It's an amazingly beautiful country with a lot of talented people that just happens to be ruled by criminal, murderous, kleptocratic KGB-led dictatorship. I want my country to be better than what it is today. And you know what? Unless we do something to bring about change, it's not just going to come on itself. I've been doing this for 25 years. I came to work with Boris Nemtsov at the end of 1999, almost 26 years actually already, more than a quarter of a century. I believe in what I do. I think this is the right thing to do. And I know my country can be better than this. And I've always believed that the only way politicians can really lead is by personal example. What right would I have to tell my fellow Russian citizens to stand up to the Putin dictatorship if I was too scared to do it myself? This just wouldn't work. A politician has to be in their own country. I mean, to me, I know why you're asking this question. You're a journalist, this is an interview. But I sometimes get this question asked by people who actually genuinely don't understand. And this is something that really surprises me. I'm a Russian politician. This is my country. This is where I have to be. And another very important aspect to this, the Putin regime rules primarily through fear. Just like the Soviet regime before, this is the main tool of their political control. They want to make people afraid. They want to have this fear become omnipresent, all permeating. This is how the Soviets rule. This is how Putin rules. And the only thing we can counter that with is to refuse to be afraid. To me, the most important lesson of the Soviet dissident movement was that fear, at the end of the day, is always a personal choice. Yes, these regimes will seek to rule by fear. They will seek to instill fear. They will seek to make fear omnipresent and all permeating. But at the end of the day, it is up to each individual person to decide whether or not to be afraid. And I believe that politicians have a duty, an obligation to show others that, no, we should not be afraid.
How do you turn that, though, into any kind of practical program? Is your thinking now to either work towards removing Putin from office, because it's clear that he sees himself as president for life, but he is only, well, I say only, but he's 73. It's not impossible that he could live for another 10 or 20 years. Or are you thinking more in terms of we just need to wait this guy out and then we can rethink the country?
First of all, and I say this in the most sincere fashion possible, I wish Vladimir Putin a long life and very good health because I want him to spend as many years in prison as possible to be held accountable for all the crimes he had committed against our own people in Russia, against the people of Ukraine, of Georgia, of Syria, of all the other countries that he's intervened into over these past 25 years. Because that will be just too easy, what you are suggesting. I mean, I'm a Christian. I know he will get a trial up there in any case. But I want him to have one here too. I want to see his face when he's sitting in that dock. And there are a lot of people who will tell you the same thing. What we know about Russia, and I'm speaking here as a historian by education, major political changes in our country happen like this, at the snap of a finger, suddenly, swiftly, and completely unexpectedly. Both the Tsarist regime at the beginning of the 20th century and the communist regime at the end of the 20th century collapsed in 3 days. There are processes that are preparing, for this change underneath, but nobody sees them. There's a very good book published last year in California by Alexei Yurchak, a prominent Russian-American sociologist. The book is about the later years of the Soviet Union, late 1980s, early 1990s. And the title of the book is It Was Forever Until It Was No More. This is exactly how things happen in Russia. And so none of us knows exactly how or when the Putin regime will collapse. What we do know, that first of all, that it will, because nothing is forever. But secondly, what we also know is that the window of opportunity that will open up for positive democratic change in Russia after this regime is gone will be very brief and small. These windows of opportunity always are. This is just a law of history. And looking back in the 1990s, and looking at all the horrendous mistakes that were made, both domestically in Russia, but also by the West at that time, that didn't allow Russia's democratic experiment to succeed back then, it is absolutely imperative that we do not repeat those mistakes the next time. Because, well, frankly, because Russia is just too important. As the world has been able to see in the worst possible way in these last 3.5 years, what happens in Russia affects everyone. And so next time there's that window of opportunity for democratic change in Russia, we have to get it right for the sake of our own country, but also for the sake of everybody in the West. Because at the end of the day, the only way we can truly guarantee long-term peace and security, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe as a whole. Russia's the largest country in Europe, don't forget. The only way we can ever have long-term peace and security on the European continent is with a democratic Russia, a Russia that will respect the rights and freedoms of its own people and that will respect the borders of its neighbors and the norms of international law. For as long as there's some kind of an aggressive, authoritarian, dictatorial regime in Moscow, Russia will continue to remain a threat, both to its own people and to the outside world.
But how do you prepare for any sort of transformation that stops that being a problem? I mean, obviously, you're right. Obviously, what would be delightful is if, for example, Russia enjoyed the same relationship with, for example, the Baltic states as Germany now does with Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. 3 small countries next to a once predatory mighty power, but absolutely nobody thinks there's any chance there of history repeating itself. How do you get to that?
I think the best way is to look at the mistakes that were committed back in the 1990s, the last time there was this window of opportunity in Russia and it was missed, and not repeat them again. And there were just 2 major mistakes, in my view, both fundamental, one domestic, one international. The domestic mistake was the fact that Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet regime, never really went through this process that lawyers sometimes like to call transitional justice, but that's actually all about transparency and accountability. We know that any country that successfully transitioned from dictatorship to democracy has gone through such a process in different ways. In South Africa after apartheid, these were Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. In Latin American states, after the fall of their military juntas, these were judicial tribunals. In Central and Eastern European states, after the collapse of communism, they had lustration procedures where they blocked people connected with the old regime from coming back to positions of power. Because when evil is not publicly reflected on and publicly condemned, it is going to come back. And this is what we saw with Putin coming back to power just 8 years after the collapse of the Soviet regime. This mistake cannot be repeated next time. After Putin and his regime are gone. And the second mistake, and this is where the West comes in, this is why it's so important to be having this conversation in London and in other Western capitals. The second mistake that happened in the 90s was committed from the side of the West, and it was the fact that the West was not really ready, or perhaps not willing, to help and assist that nascent democratic Russia on its way to a democratic transition. In the same way, it was ready to assist and help and welcome countries like Poland and the former Czechoslovakia and the Baltic states that you refer to. I have a lot of friends in the political circles in many Central Eastern European countries, and every one of them tells me how important it was for them back in the 1990s to have that promise of European and Euro-Atlantic integration as the most powerful incentive imaginable to persevere with and complete these difficult democratic reforms. Václav Havel, when he spoke to the American Congress in February of 1990, described the whole process of post-communist transformation in Czechoslovakia as our return to Europe. This was his phrase. This was important for people. Russia never really had that promise in the early 90s.
But is there not a key difference, though, in that those Central and Eastern European countries wanted to be part of Europe and wanted to be part of the Western sphere precisely because they were frightened of Russia, whereas Russia is, of course, by definition, not necessarily frightened of itself?
Well, first of all, those Central and Eastern European countries were dominated and occupied first and foremost by the communist totalitarian regime in the Soviet Union. So it wasn't about countries. But secondly, and most fundamentally, Russia is just as much a European country as the Czech Republic or Poland or Romania. I mean, we've been part of Europe. I'm not even talking about geography. I mean, that's obvious. But we are the largest country in Europe geographically, even if you take only the part of Russia west of the Ural Mountains. But no, to me, this is much deeper. I mean, civilizationally, historically, mentally, culturally, in every way you look, I mean, Russia is an integral part of European civilization. And to your point that those countries wanted to be a part of the West, wanted to be a part of Europe. Well, so did Russia, because on the 20th of December, 1991, President Boris Yeltsin of Russia sent a letter to Manfred Wörner, who was the then Secretary General of NATO. And in that letter, which was made public, Yeltsin officially and publicly for the first time raised the question of future Russian membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The 20th of December, 1991. The window of opportunity was open then. That letter never even got a response. A few years ago, this was before my arrest, I was writing an article about this for a Polish Foreign Affairs magazine, and I went to the libraries, to the archives in Washington and other places, just to look through the documents, the sources, the newspaper clippings, to see how was it even possible that something of this importance from the president of Russia is just completely ignored. And all the sources go back to the same point. As the New York Times article from that period put it, NATO officials were too taken aback by Yeltsin's letter to offer a coherent response. This is a quote. In other words, Western leaders were so shocked by the sudden collapse of the Soviet dictatorship because it was supposed to be forever, right? To go back to the title of the book. And then it was gone in 3 days. And people did not know what to do. Well, we know the cost of that failure. Because what happens in Russia affects everyone. And when Russia failed in its democratic transition domestically, that necessarily conditioned the aggressive vector of its policy towards other countries. You know, there's this direct correlation between internal repression and external aggression in Russia, because a government that doesn't respect the rights and freedoms of its own people is not going to respect the borders of its neighbors. It's not going to respect the norms of international law. And so that failure of democratic transition in Russia back in the 1990s had an enormous cost for everyone around our own country, of course now most tragically for the people of Ukraine. And this is a mistake that cannot be repeated the next time, because the only way we will ever have long-term peace and security in Europe, the only way we'll ever get to that proverbial Europe whole, free, and at peace, is with a democratic Russia. Next time, we have to get it right. And it means that we have to be getting ready for that moment now.
But do you need, at some level, a plurality of the Russian people to buy into any kind of process of soul-searching? It can't just be, can it, putting the people in charge on trial and saying this was all their fault. I mean, I think the obvious comparison people might make, and I know you've made it yourself, is with the national conversation that Germany, or at least half of Germany, was able to have with itself after World War II. Does something like that need to happen among Russians? And if so, how do you encourage that? Absolutely, yes, is the response. Because, yes, while it's specific thousands, or now I think it's tens of thousands of people who are personally responsible for these, for example, these horrendous war crimes in Ukraine, they have to be held accountable in a very personal way. Through indictments, through trials. I mean, that's important too. There has to be a real component to this. Everybody responsible for war crimes committed in Ukraine has to be held accountable in a criminal sense. But much wider than that, to your point, Andrew, yes, it's the whole society, the millions and millions of people who are not personally complicit in these crimes, but who, in whose name they were committed, if you will, right? This was the point of this conversation in Germany. And it's not like President Putin has never had any popular support. There are many millions of Russians who like him.
Well, he did win one free and competitive election. This was back in 2000. We haven't had one since. And that's not my personal opinion. If you read the reports by observers from the Council of Europe or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, there hasn't been a single free and fair election in Russia after the year 2000. But yes, that one time, he squeezed in just about by over 52%. He had just enough to avoid a runoff. So yes, absolutely. But I think the point of this is that, and again, this is the same that needed to happen in Latin American states after the military dictatorships, in South Africa after apartheid, in Central European countries after communism, yes, in Germany after Nazism, and again in Germany after 1989, in the eastern part, where you have, for example, this institution, this federal Stasi institution, where anybody who was, living in the former East Germany can come in, request and get access to their file from the Stasi, the East German security service. They don't need any permissions for that. There are no limits on that. You can just go and get it. And yes, there are always costs to this transparency. For example, as you know, after the reunification of Germany, the divorce rate in the eastern part just skyrocketed because people found out from these case files that their partners were snitching on them. So there are consequences like this that are tragic. But at the end of the day, this transparency is absolutely essential. And yes, in my final statement to the Moscow City Court before I got my 25-year sentence, I said that I have absolutely no doubt that the day will come when the darkness over our country will dissipate, and then Russian society will open its eyes and be horrified by the crimes that were committed on its behalf. This is what will need to happen. Our people, and let's not forget, and I know this is going to be shocking for many of your listeners because it is shocking for people who live in a normal democratic country in the 21st century, but as shocking as it sounds, a large part of the Russian population is not even aware of what is going on in Ukraine. He's not even aware of the horrendous war crimes that are being committed because the same week Putin attacked Ukraine, he made sure to close down all the remaining independent media outlets in Russia. And there weren't that many left by February 2022, but even the remaining ones were closed. And there's a total censorship now, total blockage of the internet, for example, the social media. So a lot of people in Russia do not actually know what is happening. And a large part of this process of public reflection will be, first of all, to tell people what was going on under this regime in the name of our country. And yes, there has to be this atonement, there has to be this public reflection, and there has to be very personal accountability for people who are actually committing these crimes.
Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.